Boardroom Bound, episode 113, The Synergies Between Leadership, Teamwork, and Governance, with Mike Useem.
Who's on a board often tells us, imperfectly at least, about how good the company is. So that ceremonial piece, the symbolic element, was important, but it's been supplemented with that fiduciary obligation and now that leadership obligation as well.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of Boardroom Bound. My name is Alexander Lowry, and this is the podcast dedicated to intentional leadership in the boardroom. My goal is to give aspiring and existing directors the tips, tactics, and strategies necessary to transform your confidence and build a successful career as a board director. Quick reminder, you can get all of today's show notes at podcast.gordon.edu. And in today's episode, we're speaking with Mike Useem. Mike is a professor of management at Wharton. This was my favorite professor back when I was getting my MBA at Wharton. He is also the director for their Center of Leadership and Change Management, and he basically works on leadership development and governance with pretty much every major leading company in the world, public, private, nonprofit. He is the author of Boards That Lead, which is one of the books that sort of defines the right way companies should go about organizing themselves and how their board should be most effective in functioning. And we're going to talk about that today. We're going to talk about the history of where boards have come from, where they've gotten to, and where they're headed. This is a fantastic episode and a personally fun one for me. Let's jump into the show. Mike Useem, welcome to the Boardroom Bound podcast.
Alexander, good to be here.
I was sharing before we went live that this is great fun for me when I reflect back on my formative time getting my MBA at the best business school in the world where you teach at Wharton. Yours is my favorite class, and I think a part of it was not only the value you gave to me from my lessons learned, but you are, I think, the best storyteller I encountered at Wharton, and I always appreciated that. So I know our audience is in for a treat today, not only getting top tips about what the boardroom space is like and how to best operate there, but I'm sure some of the war stories you have from consulting with most of the leading firms in the world.
Well, glad to jump in. Thanks for the good words. And if you wouldn't mind just sending a written note to my dean to that effect, I would be very appreciative.
If it's still Peggy, I'm happy to do that.
Peggy is still there. We have a new dean that just came in literally about 2 months ago. And you can imagine, it's not shock therapy, but she took over on July 1 in a rather extraordinary circumstance. Right. And it speaks to the broader theme of today's discussion, which is that top people, or literally everybody, but especially top people in the board, have a special calling, a special challenge, and a special need for their good decision-making when life is extremely uncertain as it is right now.
That's right. And there's been a lot of publicity for Wharton having the first African-American female leading the school, which is great. It made me very proud as an alumnus. And that's probably a good analogy for what we're going to talk about today is how all of, not only the companies can find the right directors, but directors can be the right directors themselves and bring their best board out there. And I think maybe we just start with a little bit of history, right? So, and you know all of this and you can bring it to life for us. But I would love for you to share sort of the historical perspective on the role the boards have played over time and how specifically that role has evolved, right? So when we think about probably monitoring from where it was long time ago, but even before it was monitoring, it was something else, right? It was a bit chummy.
Well, let me begin with one of the great board events, often not even seen as a board event, back in 1996. Apple, this is ancient history, but then Apple Computer was heading for oblivion, was almost out of cash. Its products were mediocre. The company itself began to look for a prospective buyer, believe it or not. And the board even at one point approached Dell Computer to see if it might want to buy Apple out. Imagine that. And a particular note, though, the chief executive at the time was not fully alarmed about the circumstance, although the chief financial officer was. And the chief financial officer happened to talk with a member of the board who had been CEO of DuPont. Edgar Woolard is his name. And Woolard, as a non-executive director, that is, he wasn't working there full-time. He was only... these days it could be a couple hundred hours a year, but it was definitely not a full-time job. But Ed Woolard, hearing from the CFO, the chief financial officer, that the company was in deep trouble, he actually began to call around himself to see if the company could find a buyer. He failed in that, so he did what has become almost an historic moment. He called up the Steve Jobs himself, the founder, but long since fired CEO of Apple, and said, Steve, how about coming back almost like the prodigal son? We kicked you out a couple of years ago, but we'd like to get you home again. And Steve Jobs said, forget it. No way, no interest. Terrible company, has no readiness whatsoever. But Ed Woolard, the great negotiator that he was, said, well, okay, just come down, take a look at what we're doing, give me your advice, and we'll follow it, even if you're not going to join us full time. Well, you know where history is going to take us on this. Steve came, walked into the first room with a bunch of engineers, told Ed Woolard, Ed, you ought to fire them all. And then Steve met with some of the staff, said you ought to fire them all. And Ed Woolard, very smart guy, and there's a point coming with this now, said, well, Steve, if you really want to make that happen, you really kind of owe it to your heritage here to come back and help out. So Steve Jobs, the prodigal son, did return. And, of course, look at Apple now, some years later, under both Steve Jobs' leadership and that of Tim Cook. The point I want to make, though, is the role of Ed Woolard. He's a director. He doesn't work there. And yet, in many respects, he saved the company, found the ideal CEO to build the company. And proof of concept, Fortune magazine a couple of years ago put out a wonderful list of the 15 biggest business decisions of all time. That's a pretty important list to try to show up on.
Right.
The 15 greatest business decisions of all time. One of those, for example, was Boeing's decision to build the 707, the first real commercial airliner in service. The Johnson & Johnson decision to adopt its famous credo, which has defined J&J's culture ever since. And one of the decisions was the decision by Ed Woolard, non-executive director of Apple, to bring back Steve Jobs. And at the outset, you indicated that if you go back far enough, this was not customary. In fact, if you go back not too many years before 1996, boards were relatively passive, more ceremonial, less substantive, but not necessarily beginning in 1996. But in that era, over the last 25 years now, boards have moved from being relatively ceremonial, a bit concerned with the returns this quarter, to a force unto themselves. And hence I tend to use the phrase boards that lead, no longer passive, no longer simply concerned with financial returns, but really central to the mission of the company.
And I think the debate used to be whether they were pawns or potentates, right?
Yeah, that's the title of a famous book by a member of the Harvard Business School faculty, Jay Lorsch, and he answered that in the negative when it was written quite some time ago. And he and many other academics, and certainly some of the big institutional holders like Vanguard and BlackRock, really now for about 20 years, have been pushing boards to get out of their passivity or their ceremonial status, and in the first instance, really get focused on financial oversight. The triple crisis that came in back in 01 and 02, when WorldCom, Enron, and Tyco all went belly up, really under the eyes of their fairly passive directors, the legislation that came out of that particular period, the early years after the turn of the century, Sarbanes-Oxley was the brief phrase for it. It was really a kind of a small revolution in thinking, in that the Sarbanes-Oxley federal legislation out of Congress, signed by the president, said that directors have to be alert, they have to be concerned, they have to be engaged. And since then, boards have become much better at bringing in people, for example, who on the audit committee know a lot about auditing, or people on the risk committee of the board know a lot about the kind of risks that a company, think about COVID-19, are facing right now, and thus can work with top management to help solve the problem. And in the years since that particular legislation, just after the turn of the century, there's been kind of a quiet revolution. Just to sum it up, here are a couple of words to describe it. From boards that were ceremonial to boards that exercise monitoring and oversight to now boards that lead. And what that really connotes is that directors can't sit in a boardroom, even if there are 10, and passively listen to the commentary and vote approve at the end of the meeting. They really have a leadership calling. Legislation says that now, and so many boards have in effect moved themselves in that direction since.
And I've heard Carl Icahn describe it this way. If you go back to the 90s, he was in a boardroom once, sort of in his corporate raider hat, looking around the room, and he saw a guy with his feet up on the table, smoking a cigar with the newspaper open, didn't care what they were talking about. There was no fiduciary standard he was being held to. He was the golf buddy of the CEO, and he was collecting his money, and he was just sort of hanging out there. We would look at that now and say, how was that ever possible? But that was not abnormal back then. So
it was pretty normal. The one story that I recall along the same line is one of America's largest companies at the time, I'll leave it unnamed, had a practice of bringing directors to lunch at the Fifth Avenue headquarters in Manhattan there. They would have a wonderful lunch, a bit of a martini with it, and as the luncheon board meeting ended, directors would pick up their plate, and underneath was a check for $5,000 or $10,000 for attending the meeting of about 2 hours. So boards were ceremonial. The ceremonial function should not be underestimated, in that who's on a board often tells us, imperfectly at least, about how good the company is. So that ceremonial piece, the symbolic element, was important, but it's been supplemented with that fiduciary obligation and now that leadership obligation as well.
And just to be clear for our audience, when we were talking about monitoring, I'm going to put the word independent out there, and I'd like to describe what that means. And I think we started to evolve into independent sort of governance committees, audit committees, compensation committees. Can you explain a bit more detail why that was so important and groundbreaking in some ways?
Well, I think the key theme that weaves through all the phrases you just used is that if a board is going to be, it's typically 10 to 11 members, if it's going to be functioning and working, to keep an eye on the financial returns and the audit issues, and if the board is going to bring independent ideas to the discussion, say right now, over how to respond to COVID-19, the board, like any team, has to be somewhat organized to get that done. So at the very top of that boardroom leadership is now the chair, or a term invented about 20 years ago, or a lead director. Very important concept. Most boards have, well, all boards now have a chair or a lead director. A chair, it's a term that's used less often in the U.S. than certainly in Europe, but there is a board chair in particular, or I should say sometimes, that is independent of the CEO. And if that's the case, then there's an independent person in the room who works closely at the elbow of the chief executive to organize a schedule, a plan, agenda for the board meeting to get the business done. If the CEO happens to be the board chair, which is the case in about 2/3 of the S&P 500, the 500 largest companies by market value, then the lead independent director works closely with the chair and the CEO and brings outside eyes to bear on the issues of the fiduciary questions, the finances of the firm, but also is the firm, for example, taking the appropriate risk at the moment in trying to reopen after COVID-19 subsides a bit. So, and then the next step some of these committees have been around for years, but the next step in taking somewhere between 10 and 11 people and drawing the most from them is for them to be organized in, call them subcommittees or just committees. So 3 or 4 board members are actually by requirement on an audit committee, 3 or 4 on a compensation committee, and 3 or 4 on what is usually called the Nominations and Governance Committee. So 3 committees, they've got very detailed roles now, usually visible on the website for the company. Taking, for example, Nominations and Governance, that committee, at least 3, all outsiders as non-executives at the firm, they are charged with being really smart about the kind of directors that they'd like to bring on the board to ensure that that room has what it needs. Somebody ought to be a risk expert. Somebody should know something about audit and finance. Hopefully a couple of the board members are former CEOs, so they know what it means to be in the hot seat. And so, Alexander, what's happened is that boards, like any team, in any company, a product team, say a finance team, whatever it may be, they are teams that are now organized like any team. They typically have all these committees will have a chair, so they have a team leader, and they've got people that know something about which they speak, and they play an absolutely vital role in getting the boards that lead function to come fully alive in the life of the company.
And so, Mike, a big part of boards not only being good at monitoring, I think we can say most of them generally are, but moving into the leadership space and having the right skill set, the background, the experience, and clearly the institutional shareholders have been very influential in pushing for this. I would love to hear your thoughts on the sort of, I will call the diversity movement into that, which is not just male and female, it's not just skin color, or socioeconomic background, but it's having the different people in there so you can have innovative thought by having different background ideas and experiences. How do you think about that now, and how instrumental is that for boards that need to lead?
It's a huge issue as we speak, and the kind of the pair of terms I tend to use is diversity and inclusion. That is, you want people of diverse backgrounds, experiences, gender, other demographic characteristics such as that. You want probably somebody that knows about business abroad along with business in the U.S. And if those people in the boardroom are actively included, such that the chair or the lead director will call on somebody who's being a little bit quiet. Okay, Marianne, what do you really think here about this $25 million acquisition? There's the inclusion part. Alexander, ample research reveals again and again, you know this, that teams and indeed even boards as a team, well composed, diverse in membership, and everybody brought into that sense that their voice really counts, net of everything else, the companies perform more strongly. Hardly a surprise if you think about it for 5 minutes, because what you want in the room is you want somebody with a sense for risk management. You want somebody, if you're, let's say, on the board at Disney, who understands what it means for a family to bring children to a theme park. And thus, diversity and inclusion in really the last 2 or 3 years has become incredibly strong as a force, especially for women. And if you just look at the numbers in that last couple of years, proportionally more women are coming onto boards to make them more diverse. And then, of course, the task of the lead director or the board chair is to ensure that everybody's voice is in the room. A common tactic, well known in other settings, is that there's a big decision about to be made, knowing often that 2 or 3 people are especially vocal about it because they got a strong view or they know more about the industry where the acquisition is about to be made than others. Board chairs and board lead directors will say, okay, let's go around the room now. I'd like everybody in 2 minutes to tell us all what they think about this issue, this acquisition. So there's the inclusion piece. So the job of the Nominations and Governance Committee is to get great people in the boardroom who represent those vital diversity criteria, including people who are more risk-averse and less risk-averse and so on. And then the job of the lead director and or the chair is to ensure that everybody is indeed in the decision-making and conversation.
So, Mike, that makes a lot of sense, but I imagine there's a bit of tension if you get all of these, let's say, 12 high-powered executives in a Fortune 50 company that probably all have tons of experience themselves, lots of value to add. There's got to be a tension between exercising the leadership that we're talking about, but not wanting to pass into the management prerogative, and how to know the line between that.
Such an important issue. And I often hear more about that in discussions with people on boards than just about anything else except for COVID-19 these days. And that is, if you have people in the room who've run a university or a medical center or another S&P 500 firm, or they've done a startup, maybe even in a tech area, they're often seen as highly desirable for board memberships these days, along with several other subcategories. Nobody is a shrinking violet. Even though a few people may be exhausted from an overnight flight from abroad, that can put them a little bit asleep in the boardroom. And thus, the challenge of this is the lead director's calling, the challenge for the lead director or the chair is to ensure that the conversation is at the right level, everybody's involved in it, and by right level, here's how it's pretty much defined. The board is there to give strategic counsel and provide monitoring and oversight. And really, it's the leadership moment for the top person who runs a given meeting. CEOs often, by the way, are helping to run the meeting as well, to ensure that the issues are, call them at the strategic level, and there is no temptation to micromanage. One chief executive, though, explained it this way by way of how he deals with that himself. He says, if I put a big board book, all these documents that directors are expected to read before a meeting, if I put a board document in the hands of directors that has month-on-month sales store by store, so this might be a big retail chain, think Target or Walmart, directors are just going to be drawn to those numbers and are going to begin to say, well, look, your location in El Paso is not doing as well as your location in Denver. Let's talk about that. In this case, appropriately so, I think the chief executive said, I stopped doing that because I know what explains inter-store sales. What the board is empowered to do is give me advice at that more strategic level. What's coming? What's around the corner? What's the future of mall locations, for example? And thus, there's a two-way, call it management relationship. One of the ways, though, from below is for the chief executive and then the general counsel who works closely with the board as well to ensure what's on the agenda and what's in the board book, that those terrains really focus on the key decisions that the CEO is going to have to make on behalf of the board. So anyway, maybe, Alexander, I'll sum it this way. Managing that divide is really hard, but an essential function for people who lead the board and the CEO itself. And maybe just by way of a colorful final illustration, many companies have gone to what is often called a delegation of authority. And I've read many such delegations, written documents, some are on the web now, that lay out what is something for board attention and what is something not for board attention. Case in point, any acquisition that's more than $25 billion has to come to the board. Any acquisition less than that should not come to the board.
So that makes a lot of sense, and I guess it relates to something I was wondering about. It's the board's job to ask really tough questions and to know the right time when to ask those questions, but also to build a strong and healthy relationship of nurturing the CEO, et cetera. How do you find that line as well?
Well, it's a tough line, and actually there are two lines there that are very important implicit in what you've said. Number two, it's just in the order you put it in front of us here, is building a great relationship between you as chair and then separately you if you are chief executive officer. And on many boards now, these two people, and by the way, chair is sometimes interchangeable with lead director. So if the CEO is chair, then there's separately designated a lead director. So the independent chair, just to take that as an entity separate from a CEO who serves as chair, an independent chair and a lead director will often get on the phone weekly. Like, what's up this week? What's going on? How's the family? How are you coping with the issues of the coronavirus? So it becomes personal for good reason, in that those individuals have to work closely together. And then the job actually coming from both sides, the CEO on one side, the board chair and the lead director on the other side, their task is to use precious time in the boardroom. A lot of very important people are in that room. They're there for maybe 2 days, 4 or 5 times a year at most, is to use that time well to focus on the really big decisions. So one company I've tracked just did a $22 billion acquisition. And I don't have direct evidence from the meeting that recently approved that acquisition, but you can imagine that they spent several board members going through the numbers, whether the pieces of the two firms fit together, what could go wrong, did they want to retain the talent of the firm they were acquiring coming into the new under the new ownership. So, quick summary on all the above. If a team is going to work well with the CEO and his or her own top management, general counsel, the chief human resources officer, and so on, they have to be, or maybe one in the order we just went through, they've really got to have a working relationship because they're working together. And then number two, they really have to focus on the big decisions because that's what they're there for.
And Mike, I guess the final question along this line of thought is everybody's got a boss, right? So the C-suite reports to the CEO reports to the board, but even the board has a boss, right?
It's a wonderful question because it's such a reminder that, well, first of all, everybody does have a boss, but in particular, historically, boards tended to be reporting really to top management. So ironically, even though the board's at the top of the organizational chart, the board members were picked by the CEO, were often friends of the chief executive. This now is way back and kind of ancient experience. Today, if you, again, take major publicly traded companies, the stock market has evolved itself from millions of independent holders and investors to a very small set of extremely well-funded institutional holders. And thus, board members are increasingly being held to account by their boss, that is investors, but in this case, investors who are extremely powerful, extremely asset-laden, and sometimes extremely vocal about what they want. Mm-hmm. At the top of that heap, just as a reminder, I think most people will know this, are BlackRock, huge New York-based investment company, Vanguard Group, an equally big investment company based just outside of Philadelphia, Fidelity up in Boston. And if you look at the ownership of almost any publicly traded company on the New York Stock Exchange, something like 5 to 10%, sometimes even more, of the shares of a given company, let's make it General Motors, are held by those three institutions combined. And the people that are at the top of those institutions, this is one of the quiet revolutions of the last 20 years, have stopped being shy about what they want from their investments. The traditional rule was if you didn't like what a company was doing, didn't believe in its purpose, or didn't believe in its damage on the environment, you sell the stock. In these days, the really big holders are so big that they really can't sell their shares readily, or in many cases, a large number of shares are tied up in the so-called index funds, in which a company, especially Vanguard, famous for its index funds, by rule, invest in the market. So there's no place for Vanguard to hide or to go if they don't like what a company is doing. So, Alexander, to get way back to your statement there, it's so totally true now. It's never been more true that directors, first of all, the chief executive and his or her team now report to the board unequivocally. No ambiguity about that anymore. And then in turn, the directors report to the big institutions, and the big institutions, helped out by activist investors, will in most cases not make much noise when it comes to the annual election in the spring of new directors to the board. But in some cases, the big investors do make a lot of noise and will literally force directors off a board if they find them wanting, or in some cases, replace the board altogether. We all have a boss, including directors.
I heard Bill McNabb, who used to run Vanguard, explain it. If you went back 20, 30 years, if the leader of Vanguard called up, J.P. Morgan said to Jamie Dimon, "I'd like to talk," Jamie might have hung up. Nowadays, he'd say, "I'll clear my calendar. Let's have a conversation."
Yes, or even, "I'm going to come to your location. Right. You don't have to come here." Right. And that's a really important point, because at the top of this world, I wrote a book on this a couple of years ago and spent a lot of time talking, especially on the company side, with chief financial officers, and then they often have reporting to them a person with the title of Director of Investor Relations. At the very top of the companies that quickly come to mind that we all know about, the very top people, the chief financial officer, the chief executive, the Director of Investor Relations, will have a relationship with Bill McNabb and Vanguard. They know each other. They're not friends in that sense, but they are respectful partners that pay a lot of attention to each other. And by the way, Alexander, just to cite one statistic which kicks around now on how big the biggest have become, the big guys, above all, Vanguard, BlackRock, Fidelity, and also a big investment firm called State Street, they have assets that are in total more than the GDP of Russia. So take BlackRock alone has something pushing now $7 trillion under management. And the GDP of Russia, last time I looked, was around $4 trillion, or Brazil. So when you say you've got a boss. Larry Fink is the guy that runs BlackRock, who he's a force of nature. Mm-hmm. And to give you just one example of what that translates into, Larry Fink of BlackRock, and this is true of Bill McNabb at Vanguard and his successor, a guy named Tim Buckley, they have been saying companies got to get more focused on the long term, that the quarter won't do it. It'll do it for a quarter, but it's not going to build a company for the next 5 or 10 years out. And that thus means we want to know if companies are bringing diversity into the boardroom. We want to know if companies have a long-term plan that may cost in the short term, but will ensure the longevity of the firm in the long term. We want to know if companies have a risk management plan in place, such that if an unknown coronavirus suddenly hits the country, the company will be ready to take actions necessary to ensure its survival. So just a quick summary cap on that. We all have a boss, and the bosses have become very important in the world we're talking about.
Well, Mike, I appreciate you sharing with us how boards can learn how to lead. And I'm going to give my summary in 2 sentences, and I'm going to ask you to give the final thought here that I guess the goal that I would take away for directors, you should do 2 things. You're going to defend shareholder value, and you're going to be a leader for the firm. But I'm sure you'll have a better way of summarizing it up for us.
I think it's a perfect summary because it references the 2 key functions of the board, is to keep an eye on top management, make certain that the monitoring is effective, at the same time with 10 or 12 really informed, really smart, really experienced in the boardroom, it would be a travesty if that talent, that knowledge is not put to use by their collaboration with top management of the company. And by the way, just for readers who are listeners who might be interested, there is a second edition of a book, and the title says it all, The Handbook of Board Governance, The Handbook of Board Governance. The editor is Richard LeBlanc. He just brought out a second edition. It's more than 60 chapters, as I recall. And there's a chapter on how to lead the audit committee. There's a chapter in there on how to work with your big shareholders. There's a chapter in there on how a CEO should work with the lead director. Thus, I think for people interested, there's plenty out there. And finally, no better way to learn all about that than to do it. And may I recommend to your listeners that they think about, if they're not already on a board, joining a community board, a nonprofit board, or some kind of business board. Best way to learn about it is to do it.
Well, Mike, we were delighted to have you on the show today. Thank you for sharing your insights and helping all of us to be boardroom bound.
All right, Alexander, best wishes to you and certainly to all of your listeners. May we all help out governance if we're called to do it. Thank you very much.
That's it for this episode of Boardroom Bound. I really enjoyed chatting with Mike Useem. Back in my Wharton experience, he was the best storyteller out of all the fabulous professors he had, and you saw that on today's episode. So he brought to life many of the behind-the-scenes stories that he personally knows from his time advising every leading company in the world, and shares that in a history of his book about boards that lead that talks through how the organizations have grown and developed in their corporate governance to where they are today and where they're headed in the future. Now remember, if you head over to podcast.gordon.edu, you can find links to all of the resources we talked about today. And please know that the Boardroom Bound team and I are so proud to be your go-to podcast for all things that connect, prepare, and empower you to land a board seat. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss any of the high-quality content that we're bringing to you every Wednesday. Thanks for joining me today. I can't wait to share more stories and strategies from brilliant business minds with you again next week. Remember to keep tuning in to be Boardroom Bound.